Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, the fortnightly podcast that explores self-awareness, leader effectiveness and leadership at all levels. Join me, your host, Nia Thomas, as we talk to today's Knowing Self, Knowing Others guest. Listeners, today I have with me Jeroen Kraaijenbrink, and Jeroen is an expert in strategy. And I think when we're talking about strategy, we can't but talk about relationships and how people work together. And Jeroen has written a really interesting book, The Strategy Handbook, The Secret Sauce to Daily Business Success. If you are interested in strategy, please do go on to wherever you usually buy your books and have a look at it. But without further ado, Jeroen, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nia. Thanks for this wonderful introduction already. Indeed, I'm a strategy person in quite a number of different roles, actually. My first career was in academia, so I have a research and teaching background. And like 13, 14 years ago, I decided to move more to practice. And what I'm currently doing is mostly consulting and mentoring. So I'm helping companies set up, define their strategy, and also execute it. And I'm coaching, mentoring individual employees, executives, entrepreneurs from a strategy perspective to rethink their business and prepare for the future.
So there's certainly a lot in there about relationships and how people work together.
Oh, yes, very much. And especially if you look at the way I work with them, especially in my consulting, for me, strategy works only if it's a very participative process. Because it is all about people, it's all about relationships. And of course, coming up with the strategic plan is good. It's an intellectual exercise. It's important, but much more important is the social engagement that you're creating through the process. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very much about relationships.
How do you define self-awareness?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal clear definition. If you're asking, also, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that. But for me, self-awareness is not just knowing yourself. It's not being just aware of who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are, or who you really are, something like that. For me, self-awareness is much more about being in control of your thoughts, being able to decide about your thoughts, maybe, and rather than just having this instinctive animal response, that you're able to sort of wait for a second and decide what should my response be. So really, yeah, being in control of your own mind, that's for me the most important part of self-awareness.
There's a school of thought that talks about that split second before you react that changes a reaction into a response. And that's really interesting how you describe self-awareness as very much that, giving yourself that thinking time before you respond with choice.
Yes, yeah, very, very much. Because otherwise, if it just is in air quotes, if you just know yourself, which is a challenge as well, but if you just know yourself, there's not so much effect. So yeah, it's very nice that you know this, but how are you using this? And I think self-awareness is it only helps if it has this control idea built into it.
Do you think there is a relationship between self-awareness and leader effectiveness?
Oh, definitely. And a positive relation as well. Because I think first you have to think, what is leadership? Leadership is all about people for me. It's about understanding people, listening to people, and helping other people to act in a way that's productive, useful, good for them, good for an organization, and so on. And the only way to do that, I think, is if you have to be aware of what other people's concerns are, what they're thinking, what their needs are, their aspirations, and so on. But that starts with self-awareness, because if you don't know that from yourself, it's very hard to try and understand other people. And also, what for me is a good leader is someone that is not just reacting but responding, that has this thought through controlled response rather than this primary first response, which is often out of fear or uncertainty, and we don't want that. And especially for leaders, we don't want that. They probably should be the example to stay calm when there is some crisis, when something has happened, when something unexpected happened. Yeah, definitely. There needs to be this self-awareness. And if I extend that from an individual level to an organizational level, because as you know now, I'm a strategy person, and I look at companies as a whole. And for me, also there, self-awareness is critical. Oftentimes, strategy is about starting outside in, looking at the world around us, see all kind of trends, uncertainties, and so on, opportunities, threats. But the true core of strategy for me is inside the company. So what are the company's core assets, core competences? What are you really good at as a company? So also being self-aware in an organizational sense is critical for strategy, for leadership.
That's a thought that I have to say that I haven't explored. The idea that there's individual self-awareness, but then there's a collective self-awareness that links to organizations. I worked on a little bit of strategy when I worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And as you're saying that, I can really see that self-awareness or organizational awareness to be able to determine what your vision, your mission, how you're going to pull that together into something that's actionable, achievable, and you do that through your organization. So it almost feels like that could be a whole different podcast.
Maybe.
Do you think effective leaders can be found at all levels of organizations?
Also, a very definite yes. And there should be, because for me, leadership has nothing to do with your position. Recently, I wrote an article for Forbes on there's no difference between managers and leaders. And that's exactly about this point where, for me, a manager, a leader, whatever we call them, their role is to guide, help, facilitate a group of people to get something done. And that applies at all levels in the organization. And luckily enough, we also have effective leaders at all levels in the organization. Also because the skills needed to be a good leader, and whether it's self-awareness or other skills, also that has nothing to do with position. I don't see that leaders higher in the hierarchy are better equipped to do that, are better self-aware. I haven't seen that. Of course, there are exceptions, there are examples, but generally, I think at all levels, you need good leadership, and there is good leadership in many organizations.
Listeners, we will make sure that there is a link to the article that Jeroen has just mentioned in the show notes. So if you want to go and click and find out a bit more about that, we will make sure you've got access to it. Do you think leaders at the most strategic level of organizations have greater self-awareness than leaders at other levels of organizations?
Unfortunately, not.
Okay.
I kind of answered that question a little bit in my previous answer. You want that because their responsibilities are bigger. The impact of what they're doing is greater. So the more self-awareness you have in important positions, the better. But I'm not sure whether that's the case in practice. Mm-hmm. As I already mentioned, I don't think self-awareness or any other sort of general skill like creativity, empathy, intelligence are necessarily correlated to position. I think position is very much dependent on a specific set of skills that may be quite independent from self-awareness. I think at all levels you have self-aware leaders, and I've also experienced clients where the problem of the company, because when they hire me, there's usually a problem there, or a question. They're stuck. They don't know how to proceed. They want to develop a new plan. They're not sure whether that's the right direction, and so on. But also, quite frequently, the cause of that problem is somewhere at the top in the organization, where people have not been able to do what's needed, or have not the right skills and the right background to do so. Of course, in many cases, that's different. They have the skills, but sometimes there's at that level people that actually lack the skills and also very much lack the self-awareness because of their position, because of their history. I don't know why, but they might have lost or not have the sort of the self-reflection, the self-criticism, and then it becomes a real problem, because if the people in power do not have the self-awareness, you're kind of stuck, because who is correcting that, or who is helping them? So sometimes, in some cases, I've seen companies where the lower or the mid-level layer, or just below the top, has more self-awareness than the people actually at the top.
When I developed my research, I developed a framework of the different levels within organizations, and that senior management to strategic. Do you think that there's something about the weight of expectation on the strategic level leaders, the stress and the expectation that we have of those individuals, that makes it that much more difficult for them to have that reflection time, that opportunity to be more self-aware?
Not really sure. And also, I'm not saying it's better developed at the lower levels. It's just that I don't see that it's really better developed at the top either. So I don't, for me, I can't see a difference at the companies I've worked with. But thinking about explanations, maybe pressure, expectations. And the challenge then also is maybe also for me to see whether they're self-aware, because I think the main issue there is being able to show your weaknesses, being able to show that you're not confident. Because being at the top of an organization, there's a lot of pressure to know it all, to be the strong leader. Because if you are weak, if you are uncertain, then that kind of projects to the rest of the organization, and everyone gets uncertain and feels uncomfortable and anxious. So I think the pressure to at least pretend kind of a lack of self-awareness, maybe I'm putting it a little bit too extreme, but you have to put up a certain face, keep up a certain image as CEO of a company. And I think the bigger the company, the bigger that pressure is to be the strong leader that everyone wants you to be.
Do you think effective leaders have more self-awareness than ineffective leaders?
Yes. And it depends on how you measure effectiveness. If you say, are self-aware leaders more, let's say, they have more financial success, create bigger companies, have more profit, create more shareholder value? I don't know. Maybe there's even a negative correlation. Maybe there needs to be research there, because I don't think that self-awareness has a lot to do with financial success of a company. There may be in the long run, but financial success can be achieved in many other ways that have nothing to do with self-awareness. If you say, do you think good leaders have more self-awareness than not so good leaders? Then I think it's a definite yes. Because as I mentioned earlier in probably the first question already, is for me, a good leader is someone who needs this skill in order to be able to really understand the people around him or her, show the empathy, and be able to respond to the needs, and so on. So there is a relationship to performance in the broadest sense, in the sense of being a good leader and having a good company, which is not just profitable or efficient, but for the standard measure of success, I don't know whether there is a big difference.
From what you've talked about, it sounds that your focus is very much more on corporate entities and businesses and companies. I come from a background of public sector organisations, and I think from what I'm hearing you saying, that there is a difference between business, because you're talking about financial success. How then does that link to a leader and their self-awareness? Whereas when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about financial success. And I think on reflection, our discussion suggests to me that there is a difference. Is that your experience, that there's a public sector difference and a private sector difference?
Yes, there is probably a difference, but it's also an unfortunate difference which shouldn't be there. That's for me maybe the main point, and I think many people are saying that nowadays and are observing that being a strong, good, effective leader in a commercial company at whatever level also requires being a good people leader, having the understanding, the compassion, and so on, the same kind of skills that you probably want in public sector companies as well.
Do you think that COVID has accelerated that shift, or has it created that shift? Do you think it's had an impact?
Not sure. I don't think COVID has had a very big impact in that sense. I think if you would ask me 2 years ago, I would have been much more optimistic about that, or more certain about that, because I expected it to have a big impact on how we think, how we act. But to be frank, now COVID it's not over, but it's kind of over for many people, at least temporary in this month. And I don't see a big difference. I think it's more part of a longer term trend that's already going on for a decade, maybe 2 decades, where this kind of old-fashioned model of the strong hero leader is eroding, and we're getting to an understanding that good leadership has nothing to do with that.
Jeroen, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners in terms of podcasts or YouTubes or other book links?
Sure. Of course, my personal website, jeroenkraaijenbrink.com, and to figure out how to type that, I think you will put a link there with the correct spelling, because otherwise no one will guess. And maybe one last thing, it's a book that I wrote a couple of years ago. For me, it was kind of a sidetrack. It's called No More Bananas.
Okay.
It's about not going bananas in the collective madness. So stay yourself, stay true to yourself, which actually has a lot to do with self-awareness.
Doesn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah. I wrote this book mainly for myself in as a first reason to kind of manage my own self. So it's an exercise in self-awareness, if you like. But it's also really meant to help other people rethink how they react rather than respond to the collective madness, all the things going on around us in the world, on social media, everything we hear and say. And so that's a way to stay calm and true to yourself. And yeah, I think that's also a useful source to develop some self-awareness.
Oh, we certainly will make sure that is available via the show notes. I think anything that we can share with listeners to help them develop their self-awareness will be very much appreciated. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Jeroen Kraaijenbrink, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you for joining me, your host, Nia Thomas, at the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. If you'd like to know more about self-awareness, leader effectiveness, and leadership at all levels, please take a look at my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. You can also join me on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Make sure you bookmark the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast and tune into the next episode in 2 weeks' time. I look forward to having you on my learning journey. If you'd like to join me as a guest on the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, please drop me a line at info@knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. If you'd like to advertise your podcast, book, or company connected to self-awareness, leader effectiveness, or leadership at all levels, please drop me a line at the same email. Please remember to bookmark the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast so that you can keep up to date with all new episodes. Remember to rate this podcast on whichever directory you listen. Knowing Self, Knowing Others is available to listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Index, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Pocket Cast,